the previous segment, we saw that in order to build and maintain a city or a kingdom or an empire or a modern state, food alone is not enough. You also need an imagined order. But this too is not enough. A third ingredient is also necessary. You must also develop techniques for storing and processing huge amounts of information. Up to the agricultural revolution, all the information that was needed in order to run human societies was stored and processed in the human brain. And this worked pretty well for tens of thousands of years. But after the agricultural revolution, as human societies began to grow larger and larger, two things happened. First, the amounts of necessary information also grew. If you want to run a town of 5,000 people, you need a lot more information than if you want to run a foraging band of 50 people. And we are talking about so much information that most human brains are simply incapable of handling all the necessary information for maintaining a town of 5,000 humans in it. Secondly, and even more importantly, if you really want to run a big town or kingdom, you need to store and process not only larger amounts of information, but also a completely new kind of information for which the average human brain is ill-adapted. This new kind of information is monotonous mathematical data, or more simply, numbers. Ancient foragers who lived tens of thousands of years ago, they had very little use for numbers. In order to survive, a forager needed to remember the shapes, the qualities, the behavior patterns of thousands of species of plants and animals. The forager also needed to remember the qualities and the character and the relations of several dozen band members. Consequently, evolutionary pressures for many, many generations have adapted the human brain for storing and analyzing immense quantities of botanical information about plants, zoological information about animals, topographical information, and social information about humans. This is something that we can remember a lot of. However, foragers were never obliged to handle large amounts of mathematical data. No hunter-gatherer needed, for example, to remember the number of fruits on each tree in the forest. So the human brain naturally did not adapt for storing and processing a lot of numbers. However, once the agricultural revolution happened and cities and kingdoms began to rise, in order to maintain a large kingdom, numbers are vital. Mathematical data is vital. It was never enough just to legislate laws and to tell stories about all kinds of gods. If somebody like Hammurabi wanted to maintain an empire, he also needed to collect taxes. And in order to collect taxes from hundreds of thousands of people, it is necessary to collect data about the income and possession of all these people. You need to collect data about payments which were already made. You need to collect data about debts and fines. You need to collect data about all kinds of discounts and exemptions. And this adds up to millions and millions of data bits which have to be stored and processed. Without this capacity, King Hammurabi or any other state would not be able to know what resources they have at their disposal and how they can utilize these resources. The problem was and still is that collecting and storing and processing all this mathematical data is something that the vast majority of human brains are simply incapable of doing. because they never evolved for such tasks. This mental limitation severely constrained the size and the complexity of human collectives after the agricultural revolution. When the amount of people and property in a particular society grew too big, it became necessary to store and process large amounts of mathematical data. And since nobody could do it, since the human brain could not do it, the system collapsed. And for thousands of years, after the agricultural revolution, human social networks remained relatively small and simple. The first that managed to overcome this problem were the ancient Sumerians, who lived in southern Mesopotamia, what is today southern Iraq. There, in southern Mesopotamia, large towns and even kingdoms began to grow around the year 4000 BC. And as the number of the inhabitants in these towns and kingdoms increased, so did the amount of information that was needed in order to coordinate their affairs and to govern the city or the kingdom. Sometime between 3500 BC and 3000 BC, some unknown Sumerian geniuses invented a new system for storing and processing information outside the brain, not in the brain, but an outside system for storing and processing information. And this new system was custom built to handle large amounts of numbers, of mathematical data. In this way, the Sumerians released their social order from the limitations of the human brain and opened the way for the appearance of larger cities and kingdoms and empires. Now, this data processing system that the Sumerians invented is called, of course, writing. Writing is a method for storing and processing information by using not our neurons in the brain, but by using material signs of all kinds and shapes. And writing was invented, it's very important to realize that writing was invented not in order to write poetry or to write philosophy or history, because this could be done without writing. You can write poetry, you can compose poetry, and you can sing songs, and you can philosophize about the universe, and you can recall the deeds of ancient heroes without writing. You can do all that in your brain. The one thing you cannot do in your brain is to store and process a lot of mathematical data, and this is the purpose for which the Sumerians invented the first script, the first system of writing. Therefore, if we look for the first words of wisdom reaching us from our ancestors 5,000 years ago, we are in for a very, very big disappointment. If you're thinking that the first words of wisdom written by humankind is some kind of big philosophical idea or some kind of wonderful poem or story, then you're in for a big disappointment. Look, for example, at this image, which is a clay tablet from the city of Uruk in southern Mesopotamia, which carries on it one of the first texts in history. What does the signs on the clay tablet say? They say, as far as we can understand, 29,086 measures, barley, 37 months, kushim. This is what the inscription says. Now, the most probable meaning of this text is a total of 29,086 measures of barley were received over the course of 37 months, signed kushim. Now, we are not sure what kushim means. It could be either the title of an office holder, or it could be the name of a particular individual whose name was Kushim. If Kushim was indeed the name of a person, he may actually be the first individual in history whose name is known to us. All the earlier names in human history, which we mentioned in previous lessons, like the Neanderthals, or like Göbekli Tepe, that site of the temple in eastern Turkey, these are modern names. These are modern inventions. The Neanderthals did not call themselves Neanderthals. We have no idea how the builders of Göbekli Tepe actually called the place, but it was not Göbekli Tepe. Göbekli Tepe is in modern Turkish. However, with the appearance of writing, we are for the first time beginning to hear history through the ears of its heroes, of its protagonists. When the neighbors of Kushim called out to him in the street, they really shouted, "Kushim, hey Kushim, come here." And it is telling that the first recorded name in human history does not belong to a prophet, does not belong to a poet or a philosopher or a great king. It belongs to an accountant. Because the first texts of history contained no philosophical insights or poetry or laws or the stories of some royal triumphs. The first texts of history were quite boring economic documents recording the payment of taxes, the accumulation of property, and the ownership of property. With the passing of the centuries, writing became more and more sophisticated, and people began to write not only tax lists and property lists, but also poetry and philosophy and laws and sacred scriptures and things like that. However, even later, even today, the most basic function of writing always remained to store administrative information and to store mathematical data, which simply cannot be stored and processed in the human brain. And this is what made writing so essential to the functioning of large society. Not poems and philosophy, but numbers. And this is true today as much as it was 5,000 years ago. In fact, it is much more true today than back in the age of the Sumerians. Today, the dominant language of the entire world is the language of numbers. Almost all states, companies, organizations, and institutions, no matter if they speak English or Arabic or Hindi or Norwegian, they all use the same language of numbers to record and process data. Every piece of information that can be translated into numbers is stored and spread and processed with amazing speed and efficiency. On the other hand, every piece of information that for some reason cannot be translated into the language of numbers is either ignored or forgotten. A person who really wishes to influence the decisions of governments and all kinds of international organizations and companies must learn to speak not English or Chinese. He or she must learn to speak in numbers. And there are entire fields of knowledge, such as physics and engineering, that have already lost almost all connection with the spoken human language, and they are maintained almost solely by mathematical script. Look, for example, at this frightening equation. This is an equation for calculating the acceleration of mass I under the influence of gravity according to the theory of relativity. When most people see such an equation, they usually panic and freeze like a deer caught in the headlights of a coming vehicle. This reaction of your eyes just go black when you see such an equation. This reaction is quite natural, and it is not the result of lack of intelligence or lack of curiosity. It is simply that, with rare exceptions, human brains are incapable of thinking through concepts like relativity or quantum mechanics. Physicists nevertheless manage to engage with all these ideas and theories because physicists learn to set aside the traditional human way of thinking, and they learn instead to think with the help of external data processing systems like writing and equations and computers. Crucial parts of the thought process in physics take place not in the head of the physicist, but inside computers or on the blackboards of classrooms or on paper where you do all these equations, because you can't do it in your head. It's not built for it. More recently, mathematical script and language of numbers have given rise to an even more revolutionary writing system, the computerized binary script, which consists of only two signs, 0 and 1. You hear me now speaking to you in English, but actually my words are recorded and transmitted to you, coded into zeros and ones inside computers. And this is not even this. It's not the end of the story of what happened with writing. As we shall see in the last lesson of this course, today scientists are trying to create completely artificial intelligence which will be based only on the binary script of computers, only on this writing system of zeros and ones. If they succeed, we will have an intelligence that speaks and thinks only in numbers. In this way, if this will happen, then writing, which was first invented 5,000 years ago as a way to supplement, to help the human brain, may eventually replace the human brain completely. But this is the future. We still first need to understand the past. In this lesson, we discussed what made the appearance of new complex society possible after the agricultural revolution. It was not only food, but also writing and the invention of new imagined orders. In the next lesson, we will explore what exactly was the impact that the new complex social orders had upon people. In particular, we will explore how some groups of people managed to gain control of these new social orders, of these new imagined orders, and turn them to their own advantage, whereas other groups of people were marginalized and exploited.